Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to one of the talks for our week of archaeology. Now, first of all, I would like to welcome you to the Chow Tuck Wing Museum, but also let you know that the museum is built on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the Chow Tuck Wing wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay our respect to the Gadigal elders, past, present, and emerging. Our lunchtime series of lectures this week to celebrate the university's unique achievements in archaeological fieldwork and research in Australia and abroad. So to find out more about upcoming talks at the Chow Tuck Wing Museum and events across Sydney and Australia for Archaeological Week, please visit the museum's website, which is www.sydney.edu.au /museums, and that'll take you through there, and for archaeologyweek.org. Right, today we are thrilled to welcome Professor Roland Fletcher to present on Angkor, Interdisciplinary Research and Urban Risk. Professor Fletcher of the Theoretical and Ancient Archaeological World at the University of Sydney. Roland's field of expertise are the theory and philosophy of archaeology, the study of settlement growth and decline, and the analysis of large-scale cultural phenomena over time. In 1955, he published The Limits of Settlement Growth, a theoretical outline and analysis of the past 15,000 years of settlement growth and decline. Roland is the instigator of the Greater Angkor project, which began in 1999 and is part of a major collaborative interdisciplinary research program by the University of Sydney. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roland Fletcher. Thank you.
Sure. And with a whole variety of researchers from really all over the world, particularly from the United States. To introduce Angkor, we need to get its location. It's a Southeast Asian city, medieval city, located on that great blue blob in the middle of Cambodia. That is the Tonle Sap, the giant lake. The significance of the giant lake for an agrarian economy in this period is that that lake covers about 3,000 square kilometres in the dry season and about 10,000 square k in the monsoon. Because the Mekong River, this river here, backflows into the lake basin and creates 7,000 square kilometres of flooded land. As you would appreciate, if you're running a rice economy, to control 7,000 square kilometres of flooded land with the highest fish yield in the whole of Southeast Asia, in addition, is a very powerful asset. The reason why Angkor is there is very straightforward. It's located just here on the northern edge of the lake, and it dominates all the communication routes east to west, north to south, and that entire resource system. Now, Angkor is not a familiar form of urbanism for many of the people who work on the pre-modern world. It's not familiar because it's a low-density city. It is a city, in fact, that strongly resembles in its form the giant cities of the modern world, the Desakota of East and Southern Asia, and the great megalopoli of the industrial world. These cities in the modern world are enormous distributed complexes with housing and countryside, farms, industry, all mixed up together. Desakota, the Southeast Asian term, means urban-rural. There is an inextricable, tangled connection of these two, which is extremely important, as you will see, in the economy of Angkor. You will often hear Angkor referred to as ancient, I think because it alliterates very nicely, ancient Angkor. but it's not. It's a medieval city. It's contemporaneous with suitable nasties like William the Conqueror and the Mongol rulers of China. It's not an ancient city at all. What's happened? As you can see from the survey plan, which was created by the Greater Angkor project from radar data obtained for us by NASA, this is an enormous, sprawling urban complex. We actually surveyed an area of about 3,000 square kilometres, which we did not do on the ground, I can assure you. This was done from remote sensing. And that 3,000 square kilometres is the entire water catchment upon which the urban complex depends. The actual urban area itself is about 1,000 square K in the middle here, which I will illustrate to you shortly. Angkor is built around a series of giant reservoirs. You just have to look at the scale at the bottom to realize the magnitude of the structures you're looking at. Those barai are 8 kilometers long. These are vast constructions. They're really on an industrial scale. Just to give you some idea of how big Angkor actually was, it's in the size range of the smaller industrial cities of the present day, and the actual urban complex of Greater Angkor was in its day the size of Sydney in 1945. If you could have taken away all the trees that would have covered the habitation areas of Angkor at its peak, you would have seen something like this: a patchy landscape of brown locations of buildings and housing spread across the landscape in a patchy configuration. What it would most have looked like, in fact, at its peak in the 12th century is Los Angeles in the 1950s, because Angkor has somewhere on the order of 4,000 ponds in it. So if you'd flown over it, it would have looked rather like Los Angeles and its swimming pools in the 1950s. Because we have a very clear idea of the amount of rice that this place could produce, and rice production is extremely consistent, we can estimate a population in this 1,000 square K of about 750,000, with about 900,000 people in the total 3,000 square K water catchment. We can now calculate, courtesy of a colleague of mine who's actually in the room, the time patterning structure of the city. These are diagrams of the time cost distance between various features of the urban complex. The one on the top left, the time cost distances along the great linear routeways like the canals and the roads. And the bottom right one is an aggregate diagram of time cost distance between the temples. People commonly get the impression that Angkor is a city of giant temples. Well, it actually isn't. It only has about 15 really big temples in it, but it has hundreds of little ones, small ones that would have fitted as a tower in the left-hand corner of this room, and that's what's represented there. It's an astonishingly beautiful place, and it's astonishingly large. This is an aerial view, in fact, from a balloon taken by my great colleague, Michael Coe, who is, alas, now dead. I always joke that Michael seemed to have a direct telephone line to God to call up whatever nice features he wanted in the atmosphere when he took his photographs. What is important to notice about this is that I want you to do a Gestalt shift. You're seeing Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is that big rectangular enclosure. Give you some sense of scale. The campus of the University of Sydney would fit inside the outer boundaries of that moat. That's the scale. Very commonly, people conflate Angkor Wat and Angkor. Not surprisingly, because Angkor Wat is colossal. But Angkor Wat is merely a temple. Angkor Wat has the same relationship to Angkor as St Mary's Cathedral does to Sydney. The edge of Greater Angkor is in the haze behind the rainbow. You are actually looking at 1/4 of the whole urban landscape of Angkor, which stretches as far as those great grey hills in the distance. That is the magnitude of what you're looking at and what we're talking about. It must have been stunningly beautiful in its time. We have a team in Monash who are doing 3D animated visualizations of Angkor. This is an image of the main causeway into Angkor Wat. This is actually a program that runs for a 24-hour day, and those little figures are avatars. They go to work. They walk in and out of the place, they change their behavior, and every time you run the program, they do different things. They're really quite extraordinary. But you can get some sense of the scale and the splendor of this institution. To come down to the very small scale, to give you some idea of just how complex this culture actually is. Every window in Angkor Wat, in that temple, has these pillars in it. And the pillars have this curious zigzag edge shape. You notice the shadow that is cast on the wall. And when you stretch that shadow, which is what happens as the sun changes its orientation during the day, what appears are the 3 towers of Angkor Wat, repeated over and over again. So down an entire corridor, as the sun moves, thousands and thousands of repeated representations of the 3 towers of Angkor Wat sweep their way slowly down the pillars. This is a very precise mathematical understanding of the relationship between shape and light. It's an understanding that was not developed in Europe until the 16th century. Again, just to remind you, we're just talking about Angkor Wat at the moment, just one temple. On the right here is a very famous town in Leiden, the medieval town which fended off the Spanish army for 7 years. Angkor Wat, just the temple, is the same size as a typical medieval European town, which is why when Angkor was first being studied in the 19th and the early 20th century, the French scholars thought of these temples as being the city. But they're not. They are simply gigantic temples, temples the size of European towns. The actual landscape of Angkor is quite different. That little rectangle there is Angkor Wat. That whole landscape is 1/3 of the urban landscape of Angkor, which consists of thousands of house mounds, thousands of water tanks, hundreds of shrines, all spread out among the rice production landscape of the city. there are rice fields immediately outside the front door of Angkor Wat. This is a completely integrated urban-rural landscape. This gives you some idea of what it looks like when you're somewhat further out in the outer suburbs of Greater Angkor. These patches which you see are the ponds, shrines and house mounds of Angkor. This is where people are living, and the brown stuff in between is where their rice fields were located. This is one of the 3D reconstructions that we've done, and those are the original rice fields which we can see off the remote sensing systems. Angkor has water management systems on an immense scale as well. This is one of the major roads going westwards out of Angkor, ultimately going towards Thailand. The critical feature of this bank, however, is not only is it a roadway, but on its upslope side, as you can see, it creates a canal because it traps all the water flowing from the right-hand side, the north, down towards the bank. The engineering of the landscape is really quite extraordinary. And people would have lived along those banks as they do today. So you would have seen great strips of habitation along the canals and the major roads, and great patches of housing and shrines all across the landscape. People are living, most of the people are living, in relatively flimsy timber houses, which are represented partially here on the great bas-reliefs of the Tapron Temple, the late 12th century temple. When I first went to Angkor, was working there in the town of Siem Reap, along one of the great Angkorian canals, which is still a contemporary river, there were squatters living whose housing probably closely resembles what most of Angkor would have looked like. When you're actually thinking about Angkor as a city, you sort of have to forget all those great temples. This is what most of humanity is doing. And the really nice thing about humanity from an archaeologist's point of view is that we produce garbage. And the really wonderful thing about canals is that your garbage, which you can see scattered all over the place there, quietly slides down into the canal. And the end result, after hundreds of years, is you get beautifully stratified garbage in the canals. Archaeologists are very strange people. We really like other people's garbage. It's the way into understanding their lives. This is a remarkable city. This is a representation, again, from our 3D animation of the outer wall of one of the temples in Angkor, with a great road that ran past it, a representation of how daily life would have functioned in this city. And it has some surprises for us. This was a surprise that none of us knew about until a colleague of mine, Christophe Potier, was spending his time taking some photographs of the famous Apsara, who are, we think, the dancers of the troupe of Angkor Wat. They're carved, there are nearly 2,000 of them carved on the walls of Angkor Wat. And he was walking along and he noticed that this Apsara appears to have a flip phone in her hand, which startled him a little. So he went up close and he took a photograph of it. And when you look at it closely, those marks which you can see are the writing of the Khmer. This woman, this dancer, one of a dance troupe, is literate. There is a substantial female elite that is literate in this society. This is not the conventional way in which we understand these great medieval states. There is a substantial degree of female literacy in the elite of this city. And it's a city of astonishing power. This is the heart, the capital of the Khmer Empire, the greatest empire that has ever controlled mainland Southeast Asia, controlled about a third of it. There is a famous description of the city in 1295, 1296 by a Chinese visitor, Zhou Taquan. And one of the comments that Zhou Taquan made as a member of the Chinese elite is very informative. He makes a single remark that the Khmer understand how to respect royalty. That's very respectful from a Chinese observer. And he talks of a circumstance every few days where the Khmer emperor sits in what is called his golden window of audience. This is a National Geographic reconstruction of it, where he sits and conducts legal decision-making. This is a very powerful group of people. Now, there are two things that we've done in Angkor. One is that we've surveyed the whole region of Angkor and the whole of the great urban complex. And we've also looked in a great deal of detail at the central area of Angkor, for precisely the same reason that if you go to New York, you tend to spend more time somewhere around Central Park than you do in New Jersey, mainly because the middle's much more interesting. But this is the problem. The middle of Angkor is still covered by triple canopy tropical forest. The whole region was originally covered by this type of forest when the French first started studying the place in the 19th century, after it had been pointed out to them by the Khmer. We had a serious problem with mapping Angkor. No aerial photography can get through those trees. And that is the map of Angkor, central Angkor, which we had in 2011. And we then brought in a remote sensing system called LiDAR. It was flown on a helicopter about 800 meters above the ground. What LiDAR does is it fires a light beam at the ground. The particular quality of light is the speed at which it goes. You can fire the signal at the ground at tremendous speed. And the particular quality of photons is that they go through very small spaces. The key to mapping through a forest, you can see very easily by standing in a forest and looking up. Because if you look up, you'll see light. There are gaps between the leaves. What LiDAR can do is go through those gaps. And if you get a photon that hits the ground and bounces back to the receiver, you get a very accurate description of the ground. So you can get a vertical slice from the tops of the trees up there right down to the ground. And there are then mathematical procedures for stripping off all that blue and yellow stuff until the only thing that you're looking at is the ground surface itself. And when you do that, that is what you see. Underneath all that forest is a grid configuration of roads with ponds and houses. There is a complete urban landscape there, which was effectively impossible for us to map, except with enormous effort. It's greatly to the credit of a colleague of ours, Jacques Gaucher, that he surveyed the interior of that enclosure, the late 12th century complex of Angkor Thom. It took about 8 years, and he managed to map the grid. It's very unfortunate that with LiDAR, we mapped the interior of Angkor probably in 12 minutes. And it's a real pity because it was a great piece of research that Jacques Gaucher did. And then bringing in the technology transformed our understanding and also showed that the grid extends outside Angkor. To give you some idea of how spectacular this is, that's an aerial photo of Angkor Wat. That's the LiDAR image of Angkor Wat. That is every house mound, every pond, and every pathway. It used to look like that. This is not only a very wealthy society and a very powerful society, it's an extremely highly organized society. And the people in it who are living in that complex appear to be part of the workforce. There are several thousand spaces, accommodation, people, individuals there. They're living in houses which are really flimsy. We can scarcely see the buildings at all. We can see some of the stonework that holds pieces of the walls in place, but all the buildings are timber. What those people are doing is they're part of the staff. They're part of the people who maintain the place, clean it, move stuff, bring resources in, and so on. This is the new map of the middle of Angkor. That is what we now know after the LiDAR work. And again, to give you some idea, burrowing back down into the kind of detail we possess. This is the famous Tapron Temple, famous because it's got trees growing all over it. This is in fact a piece of very clever heritage gardening. The French carefully removed the trees that were not aesthetic in order to keep the image of a temple in the jungle that tourists would really appreciate. This is what the Tapron looks like from the air, from a photo. That's what it looks like to LiDAR. You can see the entire configuration. We can calculate that there's a population of about 1,900 people living inside that complex. And that appears to correspond quite closely with the figure for the number of people who were pupils in this building. This was a monastery, it was a teaching monastery, training acolytes, and that appears to be where they're living. But if you go in further, again, the houses are very ordinary timber structures, of which you can just see small portions of the stonework that hold pieces of the buildings in place. So everybody's living essentially in peasant-type houses. And then you go into the temple, into the Tapron itself. Here again, we've used LiDAR. We've used scanning LiDAR inside the shrine. This is a vertical section through the shrine in the middle of that temple. It's like looking at that wall of this room. Those points that you see are pinholes. The pinholes are about this big, and in the ones higher up the wall, you can still see the metal pin. What used to be on those walls are panels. And we know from an inscription of Jayadevi, one of the queens of Jayavarman VII, that she allocated a figure, it's at least 15 tons of gold to decorate this shrine. What used to be on those walls, you can see the shadows of them, are panels. When you go to Angkor and you walk into these grey, wet, empty shrines, bear in mind that what it used to look like is what you see on the right. They were gold boxes. gold decorated boxes. All that gold vanished. It was gone before 1431, when the ruler of Ayutthaya took the city, because he makes no mention of it. And had he found even one of those panels, you would have heard all about it. So if anybody ever finds that pillar, for instance, just please give it to me, because it'll solve my research funding problems for about 300 years. You're dealing with thousands of people. The workforce, the staff who maintained that temple, was 12,640 people. I think that's more than the admin staff of the university, isn't it, Tanner? And then 66,625 farmers are obligated to deliver rice and produce to that temple permanently. That is how it is maintained. And that's where the machinery of the life of Angkor comes in. Because Angkor is an economic machine. It's a configuration of huge canals. The dark blue canals are the intake canals, bringing water in from upslope. And the pale blue are canals which either dump water to the lake in order to get rid of overload, or take it diagonally off across the landscape to supply agriculture. You can see on one of the early radar images that great 25-kilometre northern canal that used to come down to the centre of Angkor. You think, oh yeah, that's just a canal. That's how big it is. Off on the right, you can see how wide a motor car is, because you can see the car tracks. That's a typical Angkorian canal. It's about 60 to 70 metres wide and about 3 metres deep. But this is the serious stuff. The way the economy of Angkor works is it's wrapped around these giant reservoirs called barai. This is the West Barai. It's 8 kilometres by 2 kilometres, so that's 16 square kilometres of water. Over 50 million cubic metres of water. And the Barai itself, built in 1000 AD, is 3 times the size of the capital of England, London, at the same day. That's London and the West Barai to the same scale. These barai do 2 things. They act as holding tanks for overload, and they act as holding tanks for reserving water. They provide the engineers with tremendous flexibility, because the water, really interestingly, contrary to our logic, goes out of the shallowest end of the barai and is shunted eastwards and then south. They never take water out of the downslope end, because the only material they have to manage water is sand. Everything is built of sandy clay. And in order to manage water, the great hydraulic trick is to bring the water to a halt, remove its dynamic energy, and then shunt it in packages wherever you want it to go. That is the West Barai. That's at least half of the West Barai. And notice a very important feature of this world. You can't separate religion and engineering. That little rectangle in the middle is a shrine. It's one of the greatest shrines in Angkor, and it contained a 6-metre bronze statue of Vishnu. Those are real life-size Frenchmen. You can see that head and shoulders in the museum in Phnom Penh. That again is the scale of what these people are doing. And the important point to notice is you cannot detach religion from economics. Just as it's said of Europe in the medieval and early modern period, you can't separate politics and religion. Here you can't separate religion and economics. This is a rice field world. You can still see from an aircraft the Angkorian rice fields underneath the modern rice fields, even today. Those brown lines are the edges of the Angkorian rice fields. We can map the whole of the rice field configuration of the city. You can see here this little grid. These are all Angkorian rice fields. That's the edge of the Angkor Wat enclosure in the lower right-hand corner, and the airport of Angkor in the background. We've now completely mapped all these rice fields. A thesis was done here some years ago by Scott Hawken, properly entitled Angkor, Metropolis of Rice Fields. But the effects of this economy are very substantial. Because in order to have a rice field economy, you have to remove forest. And you have to completely remove forest. All of it. What you see today beginning to happen on the hills above Angkor is a repeat of a process of the removal of forest. That's the current process that's going on. And this is where the problem arises. Because Angkor thrived from the 9th century through to the 14th century. It coincided with the medieval warm phase. What it coincided with was a period of warm conditions on the planet, in consequence, very high crop yields. But as the story goes, all good things come to an end. And as you get through to the 1300s, you move into a period where the planet begins to cool down, in this case. The planet is dropping from the medieval warm phase into the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, for instance, that used to freeze the River Thames in London. And the key problem about any period when planetary temperature either rises or drops is that the process of transition is very unstable. It's very unstable because immense quantities of air has to change direction, has to shift. And you get very unpredictable and very unstable patterns. Fortunately, we've been able to measure those changes very precisely because a colleague of mine from the States, Brendan Buckley, found a form of pine tree in Vietnam, which unusually for tropical trees, produces very distinct tree rings in relation to the amount of water it receives. If it receives very little water, you get a very thin tree ring, annual ring. If it receives a lot of water, you get a very wide ring. So if you plot those tree rings, you can see what is happening to the annual monsoon for centuries. And this is what was happening. At the right-hand end is us. Back to 1500 AD is the stable pattern which we have been in for the past 400 to 500 years. A fluctuating, sometimes slightly wetter, sometimes slightly drier. But if you go back into the period before 1500, back to at least the 1350s, you're in a period of extreme climate instability, where the conditions are bouncing from extreme wet monsoons, that's the top of the peak, to extreme drought down at the bottom. What is happening is very high levels of environmental instability. It's flipping back and forth. Extremely heavy monsoons, almost no water at all. Extremely heavy monsoons, almost no water at all. And it's doing that repeatedly for a period of 150 years. The effect is that we see stark changes in the structure of Angkor. The big Barai have their great exits, their eastern exits, blocked. This is a LiDAR image of the eastern side of the East Barai, and that wall that you see there is running across the exit channel. The big wall on the right is the southern wall of the big exit channel. It was completely shut. It was completely closed off. And a new canal was brought in to try and bring water into that reservoir. What you're seeing is conditions of extreme water shortage. This is the temporary entry system that was provided. You've gone from an exit channel or an inlet channel that was twice the width of this room to inlet channels slightly narrower than a human being. And then if you look at the Siem Reap River and Canal, which runs all the way down through the middle of Angkor, and you look at all the major change points where there are infrastructure for switching water, they're all broken. There is a cascade of failure all the way down. So for instance, just outside Angkor Thom, in that red square, is this. This here is a giant dam which has been completely ruptured, and an enormous evulsion of water has broken out to the west of the dam and then punched its way down to the south, going down the main canal and running down all the way through the middle of Angkor. That is the wreckage of that dam. If you look westwards from that point, you can see the erosion. These are the great erosion channels chewed out of the old location of the great canals of Angkor. This is water tearing its way southwards down through the middle of the city. As it turns to go to the south, erosion has torn right through the occupation areas. So this brown is where people used to live, and that is an erosion channel which has torn right through a portion of that central occupation. When we excavated in there, you get steeply sloping deposits of coarse-grained sand. In other words, the signature of water moving at very high velocity. You come further down to the great bridge that was the exit from Angkor Thom. This is the bridge. This is a pretty substantial piece of engineering. The bridge is on the left. Its platform where the water used to flow is where the man is standing. The river has cut completely around that bridge, torn off the eastern end. That platform that you saw is here. The current river is up to 5 meters lower than the original canal level. That's the difference, the red, between the level of the Angkorian Canal and the blue, which is the current level, which is between 5 and 7 meters further down. That is the erosion effect. And there's a critical geophysical consequence of this. If you have enormous quantities of sand being eroded out of the upper canals of the city, that sand has to go somewhere. It's flowing southwards, and as soon as it reaches an environment where the landscape levels out, the water will lose its dynamic energy, and the sand will drop out of the water and completely fill the canals. The southern canals are totally filled with sand. This here on the right, this is the bank of the canal sloping down. You can see the edge here. All of this is sand fill. When you look at it closely, it has an interesting feature which we haven't yet managed to analyze. It comes in 3 or 4 layers, and we're not quite sure whether those layers are annual or whether they're actually just 4 big storms in 1 year. Right down the bottom, that grey stuff is the beloved garbage of archaeologists. That's the domestic waste of the people who used to live along the edge of the canal. Because of that garbage, because vegetation fell into the canals and the sand has always been waterlogged, we have had vegetation to radiocarbon date. And when you radiocarbon date the vegetation, it coincides exactly with that period of peak monsoons and peak droughts in the 14th century. Then when you go back and look at the Tapron, for instance, the Tapron is abandoned in the 14th century, never used again. And Angkor Wat has a hiatus of occupation in the 14th century and is then reoccupied. Angkor Wat has never been abandoned. It's been used as a state temple in Angkor right through to the present day. What those great monsoons did was to tear out the major water connector through the middle of Angkor, which is the red line, and to bury the rest of it in sand, the yellow at the bottom. What that did was to cut right across the whole water transmission system of Angkor. The water flows from northwest to southeast. All that system was completely fractured. We can see from Chinese tradeware, which is very easily dated, the effect of this. On the left-hand side is ceramics still dating presumably to early in the 14th century. By the time you get to the 15th century, it's really very patchy, quite rare. If you plot it chronologically, that's from 1000 AD on the left to 2000 AD on the right. You have a period between 1000 AD and 1400 where the Chinese tradewares are elite urban tradewares. There is then this very thin period from the 1400s to the 1600s. And then, quite to our surprise, we found that Chinese tradewares recovered all over Angkor. But it's completely different. It's domestic tradeware. It's the pots and the dishes which people are using for household daily life in villages. What you're seeing in Angkor is a giant dispersed urban system with a huge inertial infrastructure, an ecology of extensive forest clearance being hit by extreme instability. Concurrently, there are major new social changes, the rise of Theravada Buddhism, for instance. It's a political world that is altering out of sight. Vietnam on one side and the Thai on the other are becoming increasingly dominant and cutting away the Khmer Empire. Simultaneously, because of the connections the Chinese and the Arabs have already set up, the maritime economy of our world is beginning to develop. Essentially, Angkor was out of date. It couldn't work anymore, its infrastructure was broken, and the social milieu of its operation was vanishing. What is important to note, however, is that it is very unwise to use the terminology of the fall of civilization. I would not recommend anybody who goes to Cambodia to tell the Khmer that their civilization has fallen. Because they tend to look at you with reasonable puzzlement and say, I don't think so. Because there's a very important story of human resilience in this. This is the largest city in the world. This is the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia. It is taken apart by climate change. The population moves. The elite moves. The elite moves down to the location of Phnom Penh. But despite all of that, the Khmer state has never failed. The rulers of Angkor continued in the 16th century, after the crisis was over, to use Angkor Wat as their state temple. The city, Angkor itself, never recovered. But there is a complete distinction between the mechanics of urbanism and the business of how sociality functions. The Khmer have kept their socio-political system and their religious system functioning all the way through that crisis and up to the present day, which is to be greatly to their credit. The degree of the change is enormous. What used to be the urban heart around Angkor has ceased to be occupied, and the urban world has moved to that red set of peripheral towns. And that is extremely serious, because the same applies to the giant low-density urbanism of the Maya in the New World, where the old classic area has been almost completely abandoned and occupation has moved to the periphery. The same in Sri Lanka, where the dry zone great Buddhist cities of the medieval period disappeared and the dominant urban occupation moved to the coastal periphery or up into the hills. And in Cambodia, the area of the red dots, the heartland of the Khmer world, in the Angkorian period was abandoned, and the periphery prevailed. This appears to be some consistent relationship between severe destabilizing climate change and low-density urbanism. Thank you for your time.
Professor Fletcher is happy to take any questions, if anybody has any questions. Don't be shy.
Sefi.
Okay, thank you very much, Roland. It was really fantastic to see this. And especially how long-term investments in fieldwork are such important impacts.
20 years.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I have a somewhat selfish question.
Sure.
And I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought. But I'm so grateful to hear your present position on some of this. This has to do mostly with settlement density issues.
Right.
This is one of your favorite topics. From my perspective, in Southwestern Asia, particularly Southern Mesopotamia, which has a very clear analog to all this amazing data from the Angkor region, a lot of the, of course, I'd say sort of old consensus about Mesopotamia is that these are really dense cities.
Yeah.
And the like, but more and more we look at the things as the sort of marginal regions, a lot of these dense places that we know is changing the picture. I'm curious if you could compare and contrast a little bit
Sure.
Southern Mesopotamia and the Angkor region, in specific with this issue of settlement density, what's driving low density settlements
Right.
that seems so apparent.
Well, in the agrarian, literate urban world, there are relatively few of these mega low density systems. And very strikingly, all the ones that we've worked on so far are actually in tropical environments. where you can grow food in a particular way. It's not the same for the Maya because they don't use rice, but it appears that there is an operational advantage with those economies to having your food supply right around you. So for instance, in Angkor, that 66,000 people who are delivering food to the Tapron are the people living in Greater Angkor. And what they're doing is they're using the canal systems and the road systems to deliver that. So it's a really advantageous system. You don't have a hinterland outside your town. You have your food supply inside your urban system. And generally, that's not a pattern that has worked all that well, so far as we can judge, and doesn't seem to work well for the other grain economies. Which leads to the great question of why didn't the Chinese do this? And particularly, why didn't the Chinese in the Yangtze do it? And then you run into the key things that we always have to deal with in archaeology is how is the place organized? And that's the critical issue eventually. There is some fundamental difference in the way that these low-density systems are organized compared to the ones that you're familiar with, or the great Chinese states, or the European cities. Because the big surprise is that in the other compact urban systems, though we tend to think of our compact cities as big, they're actually very small. And Imperial Rome, which everybody is tremendously impressed by, is 18 square kilometers. It's half the size of the central patch of Angkor. All European cities until the 19th century were really quite small. They were rarely more than 30 square K in extent. The Chinese got up to 100 square K, but no further. And the Mesopotamian cities generally stay in a fairly small size range. And Babylon, I think, was 12 square K. Yeah. So there's a whole debate about how the advantages of this compact system. And that, I think, is the really big deal because of the work of people like Betancourt, showing that there is a scaling effect, that if you are close together in fair numbers, there's actually a cumulative value return. And that would suggest that that's really present for compact cities, but may only exist in low-density cities in very small areas in the middle. So there's a whole series of socio-political implications there. It seems to me that this relationship between compact and dispersed and how hinterlands work and so on is one of the key issues that archaeology needs to address because it's the basics of the mechanics of society. So it's a super topic. We just have to be able to get back and work on these compact cities in other areas in the world, like you do.
Yeah, I think we're finding that places like Babylon, we know so well about the interior because it's so visible archaeologically.
That's right.
Tangible. But the exterior, it's the farmsteads, the fields that are
Indeed.
we know are there, but never really been properly investigated. So this dispersion seems to have different patterns there as well.
Well, to give you an example of a project that arose because I gave this talk in Rome a couple of years ago, and a Norwegian classicist, Simon Malmberg, stuck his hand up at the back of the room and said, "Why isn't Rome a low-density city?" And he said, "Because of the Tiber Basin. Why don't you treat the Tiber Basin as the whole city, with Rome in the middle?" So we've started a discussion and a project where Paul Provodoris is looking at the configuration of entities around Rome and entities around Angkor. And the really interesting thing is that within the urban area of Greater Angkor, there are far more spread out features than there are in the Tiber Basin around Rome. what's in the Roman system is rammed into that city in the middle. So if you looked at it in terms of a cross-section, Rome is like this, and then it levels off. And Angkor, from the middle outwards, is like this. So we're trying now to see if we can get a rigorous cross-comparison using Rome and Angkor to see if we can actually home in on this issue of what's hinterland, what isn't, what is suburbs, what isn't. Because it's really important for the discussions we have. So thank you. Oh.
I'm aware the time's starting to run out. I think there was one more question, was there? And then we can...
Hi.
Roland, so
Yeah.
the south and immediately adjacent to Angkor, you've got this great sedimentary dustbin
Yeah.
that's on my side.
You shouldn't tell Dan that you call his lake sedimentary dustbin.
And I don't know what that's done actually. I know it's been working.
Yeah.
I assume there's an environmental record there. And I assume that says something that throws light on the great sort of hydraulic disaster that so changed the city. And I wonder if you could just tell us what he's found there and what information he's provided.
Well, what is really frustrating and really led us to despair when we first started to work there was that given you have this gigantic lake, we expected an enormous stratigraphic sequence, which would essentially give us the entire story of the environment of Angkor for 4,000 years. There is almost no deposition in the Tonle Sap at all. I think the whole of the history of the lake, I think, is in about this much sediment. And the reason is very striking. If you look at the Tonle Sap at any point in time, it is always brown. It is always dynamic. There's always water flowing through it. There's a massive flow in and out of it. Its water never settles. And the result is that the stratigraphic record in the lake is very small. People have said, oh, the Tonle Sap will fill up. The Tonle Sap won't fill up. It's filling in from the edges. The stratigraphic story is around the edges. But very interestingly, the lake doesn't actually fill. We would have expected an enormous signature from this disruption in the 14th century, but all it appears to have affected is really intense water flow in the lake. It's one of the most serious surprises that I've ever had in research, because we thought we would just drill big cores in the lake and that would be it. That would give us the data. And it's not there.
Perhaps you should move to the delta. I mean, looking at your photos, there's an enormous delta at the moment.
Oh, there's plenty of... Oh, there is gigantic quantities there. One of the nice things that I'd like to investigate one day, or get somebody to investigate, is that there is actually a delta at Angkor. Immediately to the south of the big hill, the Nom Krom, which is on the edge of the lake, is actually an arc of sediment which has never been worked on. It has previously been quite difficult to access. But that's where we should ultimately be able to find the stratigraphic record. But that was really very problematic to get into at the time when we were first there, because it's extremely heavily vegetated. But that's one of the things that we would really like to do. But it's been a real surprise. And we found that the big swales that run down the edge of the lake, as the lake has been filling in, are comparatively recent. They're all post-10th century, which is really not what we expected at all. So it's quite a problem. Thank you.
Again, I'm sure you'd like to